There was a physique that everyone wanted. The sport decided to get rid of it. Every man who wins the Mr. Olympia receives the same trophy, a bronze casting of Eugene Sandow, the Victorian strongman whose proportions defined the classical male ideal. Sandow competed at approximately 5 feet 9 inches, between 185 and 195 pounds, with a 30-inch waist, a 48-inch chest, and arms and calves that both measured exactly 18 inches. That trophy isn't an award for the heaviest man on stage. It's a three-dimensional argument for proportion, for the specific mathematical relationship between the widest points and the narrowest ones, between mass and structure, between how much a man weighs and what that weight actually looks like when organized correctly. The Sandow standard was the golden ratio made flesh, a shoulder-to-waist proportion of 1.618 to 1, the same mathematical relationship found in the spiral of a nautilus shell and in the proportions of the Parthenon. For about 30 years, from Larry Scott's first Mr. Olympia win in 1965 through the 8 championships Lee Haney held through 1991, the men who won that trophy looked like it. Not perfectly, not identically, but recognizably. The physique that received the Sandow described the same ideal the Sandow depicted. Then, quietly, without a press release, without a formal rule change, without any public announcement of any kind, the judges started scoring something else. Every competitor in the world understood immediately what the new standard was, and the sport became something the Sandow Trophy no longer described. This is the story of that change, what was lost precisely, how it happened, and why the governing body that made it was eventually forced, 23 years later, to build an entirely separate division just to resurrect what its own judging had killed. The golden era of competitive bodybuilding spans roughly the 1960s through the early 1980s, and its governing aesthetic principle was mathematically defined. The V-taper, broad shoulders and wide lats tapering to a narrow waist, wasn't a vague preference. It was a specific, measurable ratio of shoulder width to waist width, targeted at 1.618 to 1. The IFBB's own judging framework listed fitness, symmetry, proportion as its primary criteria. Academic research on competitive bodybuilding history documents that early IFBB competitions allocated only about 25% of total scoring to muscularity. The remaining 75% went to symmetry, proportion, and presentation. Competitors were scored down for deviations from the proportional standard. Arnold's New Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding stated the philosophy as plainly as it could be stated. It's just physically impossible for a 320-pound bodybuilder to have the same aesthetic quality as a properly proportioned competitor at a lighter weight. That wasn't editorial opinion from a nostalgic former champion. That was the sport's governing thesis in its own definitive reference text. Frank Zane won 3 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles, 1977, 1978, and 1979, at approximately 185 pounds. He stood 5 feet 9 inches and never competed anywhere near 200 pounds. He beat men who outweighed him by 30 or 40 pounds, repeatedly, because what he brought to the stage couldn't be manufactured by additional mass. His physique was a precise argument for the principle that the human body, organized correctly, communicates power through proportion rather than volume. An academic source described Zane as having perfected the aesthetics-first formula and noted explicitly that competitors with distended features were penalized under the standard he exemplified. Distended, a word that would come back to describe an entirely different era of the sport. Arnold Schwarzenegger competed at approximately 235 to 240 pounds across his career. A 1967 publication documenting his physical measurements recorded his body weight at 235 pounds, waist at 31 inches, alongside a 55-inch chest, 20.5-inch arms, and a height of 6 feet 1 inch. By 1974, at what Muscle and Fitness has described as his heaviest and best condition, he weighed over 240 pounds, and his waist had expanded to 34 inches. That 34-inch waist at 240 plus pounds on a 6 foot 1 inch frame is the arithmetic of the golden era. More than 240 pounds of muscle organized on proportions that, standing on a stage under a spotlight, read as a sculpture of capability rather than excess. Arnold crossed from the stage into mainstream American culture in a way no bodybuilder had before him or has replicated since. The Terminator in 1984, Predator in 1987, Total Recall in 1990, Governor of California in 2003. His physique was aspirational to people who had never heard of the IFBB, who didn't know a lat from a tricep, who just looked at that frame and recognized something: the human body at its most capable and most proportional simultaneously. Men put his poster on their walls. They joined gyms, not to look like something alien, but to reach towards something powerful and achievable, something the eye registers as an amplified version of the human ideal rather than a departure from it. The IFBB's scoring in that era reflected the same logic. It didn't reward the biggest man on stage, it rewarded the best organized man on stage. The competitive brief was proportion: V-taper, symmetry, flow. A muscularity that appeared natural and proportional rather than extreme. Elite competitors during this period ranged from Zane's 185 pounds to Arnold's 240, eventually to 254 with Lee Haney, a spread of nearly 70 pounds among the era's champions, unified by the same proportional commitment. Different weights, same ideal. The judging criteria existed, in theory, to enforce that ideal rather than reward whoever could deviate from it most dramatically. Lee Haney won the Mr. Olympia 8 consecutive times from 1984 through 1991. His era sits at the boundary of competing historical interpretations. Some mark the end of the golden era at 1984, when his reign began. Others treat his entire championship run as its final chapter. Arnold's new encyclopedia describes what defined his dominance in specific physical terms: wide shoulders, flaring lats, narrow waist, good calves. His competitive weight was 254 pounds. His waist measured 31.5 inches. Hold those two numbers together: 254 pounds of competition-ready muscle on a 31.5-inch waist. The proportional relationship at that scale, the V-taper maintained through 8 Olympia titles at that weight, is the physical evidence of what the aesthetic era required at its highest level. He wasn't a small man trying to appear proportional. He was a large man who refused to let size consume proportion, because the standard he'd built his entire career around said the distinction mattered more than the additional mass. He has described what maintaining that required in his own words. He had to sacrifice size in order to maintain the proportional ideal. The path toward more mass was as available to him as to anyone. He chose not to take it. His training philosophy, codified in 3 words, expressed the same logic: stimulate, don't annihilate. A fitness publication documented the approach in full. Lee Haney trained by the motto of stimulate, don't annihilate. Haney believed in using proper form and advocated quality, not quantity. Quality, not quantity. The proportional standard demanded restraint as much as effort. Haney has reflected on the standards of his era with the vocabulary of measurement rather than nostalgia. The shoulder and waist ratio was very important during the era which we came through. And about what followed, in a sentence whose trailing off is more damning than any complete thought. A lot of the bodybuilders now focus on size. Everything is about how much. His era was about what? The era that came after him was about how much. That shift, from a qualitative standard to a quantitative one, is the entire story of what went wrong. Arnold's new encyclopedia closes its account of the Haney years with a sentence that functions, in retrospect, as an epitaph. He retired, and we entered an era in which massive physiques would dominate. One clause, one word changed from proportional to massive, and 30 years of judging philosophy reversed. The encyclopedia doesn't editorialize. It doesn't need to. September 14th, 1991. The Walt Disney World Dolphin Hotel, Orlando, Florida. The prejudging round of the Mr. Olympia is the contest that matters. It's where the judges actually score, where the comparative rounds happen, where the rankings are effectively determined before the evening show begins. The evening show is production. The final results ratify what the prejudging decided. On September 14, 1991, when the prejudging round concluded and the judges tallied their scorecards, the 8-time champion Lee Haney and a 29-year-old making his Olympia debut were tied. Exactly tied. The man who had won every Olympia he'd entered for 8 consecutive years, carrying 254 pounds on a 31.5-inch waist, had not separated himself from his challenger through the full duration of competitive judging. Dorian Yates, who trained largely in isolation at a Birmingham, England gym called Temple Gym, who had flown in from the industrial Midlands to compete on the most significant stage the sport possessed. He was tied with the 8-time champion after every judge had submitted every score. Yates had earned the right to be there. Earlier in 1991, he'd won the Night of Champions in New York, the qualifying event that signaled serious Olympia challengers. He'd approached the contest with the question any honest competitor asks before a debut at this level. Could I really possess the best physique in the world? His training method was the theoretical inverse of everything the high-volume pump training of the golden era had represented. High-intensity, minimal volume, sessions under an hour, 3 to 4 times a week, everything taken to genuine muscular failure. He'd built his theoretical foundation on the high-intensity principles of Arthur Jones, carried them to a competitive extreme, and trained them in near-total solitude. When he stepped onto the Olympia stage in Orlando, almost nobody in the American bodybuilding press had seen what he looked like at full conditioning. What they saw was a physique that was dense in a way the golden era had not specifically optimized for. Haney carried mass with aesthetic proportion, the classic V-taper expression at 254 pounds, the sort of physique that the 1.618 to 1 shoulder-to-waist standard was designed to reward. Yates carried mass with a muscular density that read differently under stage lighting. Harder, grainier, more striated at every angle. He was compact where Haney was flowing. Where the golden era aesthetic had emphasized what competitors of that period called flow, a muscularity that appeared natural and proportional, Yates presented something that looked engineered with different priorities. The judges found them exactly equal through prejudging. In the evening show, they found Haney by exactly 3 points. Haney accumulated 5 judging points across the 4 scoring rounds to Yates's 8. In bodybuilding judging, lower totals mean better placement. A 3-point margin across 4 rounds is the minimum viable separation between first and second. Haney received $100,000. Yates received $50,000. Haney then retired with the stated reason: "There's nowhere else to go but down." Those 4 words have been interpreted, mostly, as the declaration of a wise champion choosing his exit on his own terms, leaving before decline could arrive, walking away from the record he'd set rather than letting someone else take it. Maybe that's the entirety of what he meant. What's certain is that the sport he'd defined for 8 years walked off that stage with him. The result, Haney's 8th title, has been absorbed into history as the clean conclusion of the aesthetic era. What it conceals is the genuine precariousness of that conclusion. A 3-point margin over a tied prejudging round doesn't communicate the old standard won decisively. It communicates something considerably more unsettling. The old standard survived by the minimum viable amount against a challenger making his debut, who was 29 years old and who had absolutely no intention of finishing second again. Competitors read scorecards the way any professional reads performance data. A dominant Haney victory in 1991 would have sent one signal to every professional bodybuilder on the circuit: the proportional standard holds, keep building within it. A 3-point margin over a tied prejudging sent a different one. A new approach is within 3 points of winning the most important contest in the sport, and its practitioner is returning next year. Dorian Yates was already clear about his own assessment. This was actually the last time in his career where he wouldn't be placed first. Not, "I almost had him." Not, "I plan to improve and return." The last time he wouldn't be placed first. Present tense certainty about future placement, declared immediately after the only professional loss of his career. He went back to Birmingham and opened his training log. Had the gap been wider, had Haney won decisively rather than by the minimum viable margin, the subsequent story might have unfolded differently. Nobody can say with certainty. What can be said is that the 1991 Olympia wasn't the moment the sport changed. It was the moment the sport came within 3 points of changing, while the last man defending the old standard took his trophy and retired. The distance between those 2 moments is negligible. The 1992 Mr. Olympia was held in Helsinki, Finland. Yates won. He ended Haney's 8-year run on the first attempt without his primary adversary present, defeating Kevin Levrone and Lee Labrada, 2 genuinely aesthetic competitors, and taking his first title. He came in at approximately 242 to 243 pounds on stage. By his own later account, it was his worst prepared win. He posted to Instagram years afterward, describing what happened in the final weeks of prep. 4 weeks out, he was 255 pounds, with still a month to go. As he looked back on the pictures and records, he realized that when he was 5 weeks out, he was contest ready. But he lost another 12 pounds of mostly muscle. He won the 1992 Olympia at arguably his smallest and leanest, having burned off more of his own muscular development than intended during the final push. He won anyway, because even at his underprepared best, he outscored everyone on that stage. He returned to Temple Gym in Birmingham with a very specific piece of information. The 12 pounds he'd burned off in over-dieting were already demonstrably competitive at the Olympia level. Earning them back deliberately and keeping them at peak conditioning would make the 1993 version of Dorian Yates whatever the 1992 version had only approximated. What followed was 12 months of systematic off-season development. Yates has described what that year produced directly. A great year of training ensued after the Olympia, and as a result, he got vastly bigger, putting on 7 to 8 pounds of muscle, which for a top pro represents a substantial and deliberate gain. He wasn't simply eating more. He was tracking, testing, applying the same systematic intensity to off-season development that blood and guts applied to each individual training session. The same precision that Temple Gym's isolation had always enabled. 3 weeks before the 1993 Olympia, he weighed 279 pounds. His 1993 stage weight, confirmed in his own Instagram account, was 257 pounds. He had arrived at the pre-contest period at 279 and dieted down to 257 in roughly 3 weeks, shedding approximately 22 pounds of water and body fat while preserving every pound of the additional stage muscle he'd built across the preceding year. His 1992 stage weight was approximately 242 to 243. His 1993 stage weight was 257. That is 14 to 15 additional pounds of competition-ready muscle at peak conditioning under stage lighting designed to reveal every fiber. Flex magazine ran comparison photos. Yates several weeks out from the 1993 Olympia, alongside photographs from his 1992 championship condition. The images didn't require analytical expertise to interpret. The 1992 version was lean and competitive. The 1993 version was something the sports press had no established vocabulary for. Yates himself described it as the first glimpses of that dry, grainy look that would define my later Olympia wins. The judges saw the same thing everyone else saw. They awarded Yates his second title. What that scoring decision communicated, in the only language that matters in a professional sport, was, this is what winning looks like now. The additional 14 to 15 pounds of stage weight, organized into the dense, striated, grainy conditioning Yates had engineered over 12 months in Birmingham, had not cost him votes. It had secured them. Every competitor who read those scores understood the arithmetic immediately. More mass with comparable conditioning produces better results. The incentive structure had shifted, and it had shifted in the most authoritative way possible, through the aggregate judgment of the scoring panel at the world's most important bodybuilding contest. Before the straightforward narrative of judges rewarding mass over aesthetics runs too far ahead, there is a counterargument worth acknowledging, because the case is stronger when it's honest about the evidence. Throughout the Yates era, two genuinely aesthetic competitors, Shawn Ray and Flex Wheeler, regularly placed in the top 5 at the Olympia. Arnold's New Encyclopedia described Wheeler as aesthetically awesome. Shawn Ray accumulated top 5 finishes across 12 Olympia appearances that encompassed the entirety of Yates's reign. The judges didn't simply dismiss aesthetic physiques from consideration. They rewarded them at 2nd, 3rd, and 4th place. What they consistently awarded first place to was a different category, one that prioritized extreme mass with the conditioning to make it competitive. First place is the signal, because first place defines what winning requires. Placing second repeatedly to a mass-oriented champion communicates to everyone below you. You can build the most aesthetically precise physique on that stage, and it won't be enough. The counter-argument is real. The conclusion it leads to is the same one. Yates acknowledged Haney's aesthetic qualities directly. Lee Haney had a great physique, of course. Small waist and hips, wide shoulders, good structure. That, of course, is doing considerable work. It's the acknowledgement of a standard that was genuine and real, and that had become, by 1993, insufficient. Flex magazine's characterization of the Yates era compressed the new order into 4 words. Dorian's world. We're just visiting it. They weren't wrong. And the judges had built that world, one scorecard at a time. Yates inhabited it. Those are different levels of culpability, and conflating them misidentifies the actual mechanism of what went wrong. When you change what judges reward, you change what competitors chase. This isn't a complicated observation. Professional athletes aren't sentimental about incentive structures. After 1993, every professional bodybuilder on Earth had received the same message through the most authoritative channel available. Mass with extreme conditioning wins. The proportional aesthetics of the golden era, the V-taper, the 31.5-inch waist at 254 pounds, the shoulder ratio, were no longer sufficient to take first place at the sport's most important event. So they chased the new standard, because that is what you do when your livelihood depends on winning, and winning has just acquired a different definition. The arms race has a trajectory that can be tracked in documented stage weights. Frank Zane won the Olympia at 185 pounds. Arnold Schwarzenegger competed at approximately 235 to 240 pounds. Lee Haney's 8 titles came at 254 pounds. Dorian Yates competed across his 6-year reign at 255 to 265 pounds. That is the full progression through the aesthetic era and into the transition. 185, 240, 254, 265. Meaningful escalation, but still organized around the same proportional logic, the same commitment to the relationship between mass and structure. Then Ronnie Coleman arrived and took the judges' signal wherever it needed to go. Coleman had placed 9th at the 1997 Mr. Olympia. 9th. He came back the following year at 5 feet 11 inches, weighing approximately 296 pounds on stage, and the judges awarded him first place. He held that title for 8 consecutive years, winning in 1998 through 2005 and tying Lee Haney's record, though at 42 pounds of additional stage weight above Haney's competitive weight. At the 2003 Olympia, Coleman weighed 292 pounds at competition conditioning. Not off-season weight, not a training photo. 292 pounds of peak condition Olympia physique, on stage, under lights, accepting the Sandow trophy that depicts a 30-inch waist. His off-season weight crossed 300 pounds. Track that trajectory from the golden era baseline. 185, 240, 254, 265, 296. The span from Zane to Coleman covers 111 pounds of additional stage weight over roughly 25 years. The single largest increment, from Yates's competitive ceiling to Coleman's debut weight, is 31 pounds in 5 years. That gap didn't come from superior training methodology. It came from the judges having established, through 5 years of consistent scoring, that additional mass with maintained conditioning was rewarded, and from Coleman possessing the specific genetic capacity to test that principle further than anyone preceding him. Lou Ferrigno, attempting to remain relevant in the new mass era, came into the 1992 Olympia at 318 pounds, the heaviest competitor at that contest by a significant margin. He didn't win. The arms race had a ceiling somewhere above 296 pounds of actual competition conditioning, but nobody could identify where it was because the judges had never set one. Every professional bodybuilder watching the scores arrive at each Olympia was receiving the same data set. More mass, as long as conditioning holds, is rewarded. Find the ceiling on your own body, or someone with a higher ceiling will beat you. The sport had become, as one competition preparation handbook eventually described it plainly, primarily a mass game. What competitors were chasing to maintain and extend their mass required pharmaceutical tools that didn't exist in the sport's golden era and hadn't been necessary during it. Steroids had been part of competitive bodybuilding since the 1960s. Used throughout the golden era without producing the specific physiological consequence that was now becoming visible on the Olympia stage. The additional layer, the one that separated mass era protocols from everything that had preceded them, was insulin and human growth hormone, used in combinations and at volumes that had no precedent anywhere in competitive sport. The bubble gut, medically termed palumboism or abdominal hypertrophy syndrome, is documented in peer-reviewed medical literature as a consequence of human growth hormone and insulin protocols specifically, not steroid use alone. The mechanism is precise. HGH enlarges the mesentery, the gut tissue itself, and the abdominal musculature. Combined with insulin, which mass-era competitors were adding to drive nutrient uptake and cellular fullness, and daily caloric intakes exceeding 10,000 calories with over 1,000 grams of carbohydrates to support the muscle volume, the abdominal cavity expanded from the inside out. Dr. Thomas O'Connor, who has studied this phenomenon in the context of competitive bodybuilding history, noted that steroids were used extensively through the 1970s and 1980s without producing this result, establishing that the insulin and HGH combination was the causal mechanism, not the anabolic compounds that had preceded it by decades. Competitors in the mass era were reportedly taking HGH at doses exceeding 10 international units, roughly 5 times the 1 to 2 IUs prescribed for legitimate medical purposes at anti-aging clinics. The visual consequence became progressively more apparent on the Olympia stage through the Coleman era and the years that followed it. A distended abdomen that pushed forward even at peak competition conditioning, visible during a vacuum pose, the pose specifically designed to demonstrate the narrowness of the waist, now producing a convex rather than concave result. Phil Heath, winner of 7 Mr. Olympia titles, displayed it. Kai Green, 4-time runner-up, displayed it. The abdominal protrusion didn't disqualify these competitors from first-place finishes, because the judges had established no criterion for penalizing it within the mass scoring framework they'd been applying since 1993. The V-taper the Golden Era had defined as the fundamental visual standard of the sport wasn't merely reduced by these developments. In the most extreme presentations on the Olympia stage, the visual logic was inverted. The narrowest point of the torso was supposed to be the waist, the bottom of the V, the anchor of the proportion. In the worst cases the stage produced, the waist was now the widest point. Every year, the men accepting that Sandow trophy stood in physiques that the Sandow trophy no longer described. The physical toll went past aesthetics and into hospital records. Mike Matarazzo competed at the professional level through the mass era. On December 8, 2004, he underwent open-heart surgery and retired from competition that day. On November 8, 2007, he suffered a heart attack. He died on August 16, 2014, at Stanford Hospital, where he had been waiting for a heart transplant. He was 48 years old. Greg Kovacs competed through the mass era and died of heart failure on November 22, 2013. He was 44 years old. Business Insider documented the pattern plainly in 2022. Extreme mass combined with performance-enhancing drugs can devastate the heart, liver, and kidneys. Medical analysis comparing mortality rates across bodybuilding's eras has documented measurably shorter lifespans among mass-era competitors compared to those who competed in the golden era preceding them. These are the downstream consequences of a judging philosophy, extended across time until they became visible in death notices and hospital waiting lists. The judges didn't inject anyone. The judges didn't prescribe protocols. But when judges consistently award first place to extreme mass with extreme conditioning, competitors whose livelihoods depend on winning will pursue extreme mass with extreme conditioning by whatever means are available. The judges built the incentive. The competitors followed it where it went. The cardiovascular system doesn't distinguish between the party that created the incentive and the party that responded to it. The general public, with no access to scorecards or pharmaceutical logs, rendered its verdict through the only mechanism available to people who aren't formally part of a sport. They stopped finding it aspirational. The Golden Era produced crossover figures. Arnold's physique sold movie tickets to audiences who had never heard of the IFBB, made the covers of mainstream magazines, generated gym memberships among people who couldn't name a single judging criterion. The Golden Era physique was aspirational to the uninitiated because it communicated something the human eye recognizes without instruction: power organized into proportion. It looked like what strength is supposed to look like at an extraordinary scale, an amplified version of the human ideal rather than a departure from it. The mass era produced a different cultural response. eventually formal enough to enter academic publishing. Scholars titled books Bodybuilding, a Postmodern Freak Show. Peer-reviewed research developed the specific terminology of strategies of infrequent to describe the aesthetic logic of mass-era competition. Other academic work categorized mass-era competitors under muscular otherness, meaning a physical presentation that registers primarily as spectacle rather than aspiration. These weren't hostile commentators writing from outside the sport. These were researchers who had studied competitive bodybuilding seriously and were choosing the most accurate language available to describe what they observed. The word freak wasn't being deployed as an insult from the outside. It was a category being established by the same institutional apparatus that studies cultural phenomena. The mass era's most extreme presentations were being classified, in the peer-reviewed literature, as a form of exhibition rather than a form of inspiration. No Men's Open Mr. Olympia champion of the mass era achieved the mainstream cultural crossover that Golden Era competitors had established. Not one became a film star. None became a political figure. None became the kind of cultural reference point for physical aspiration that Arnold had represented. The physique that a person with no connection to competitive bodybuilding could encounter on a movie poster and feel something toward. The sport had given the world the Terminator's physique in 1984. By the early 2000s, it was producing physiques that the world looked at from a categorically different cognitive distance. People didn't aspire to them. People looked at them. The distinction between aspiration and spectacle is the entire commercial difference between a sport that grows its audience and a sport that narrows it. No television ratings data or PPV buy rate figures from the Olympia's mass era exist in comprehensive form to document that narrowing precisely. What can be documented is the cultural abstraction. The sport that had made Arnold into the Terminator was no longer making anything the mainstream recognized as the same ideal. The fans who had put posters on their walls weren't putting up posters of the 2003 Olympia stage. Not because they'd stopped caring about physiques, but because the physique on that stage had become something they didn't recognize as the same thing the posters had depicted. In 2015, the NPC and IFBB announced they were creating a new competitive division. In 2016, it launched. They called it Classic Physique. The official announcement framing was specific. In 2016, Classic Physique will no longer be a descriptor for the builds of bodybuilders from a bygone era. It will be a new competitive division of the National Physique Committee. A bygone era. Those three words are embedded in the announcement sentence without further explanation, as though the governing body expected everyone to know which era was being referenced. They did know. The era had a name. The era had ended. The governing body had watched it end, had, through its scoring decisions, participated in ending it, and was now naming a new division after it. The IFBB Congress formally ratified Classic Physique as a recognized sport discipline on November 4, 2016. That is the official date the sport created a container for what it had spent 23 years refusing to reward in its primary division. The structural architecture of Classic Physique is where the implicit admission lives. The division implemented height-based weight caps from its first competition. Under NPC amateur rules, a competitor standing up to 5 feet 4 inches is limited to 167 pounds on stage. Under IFBB Pro League rules, the ceiling for the same height is 177 pounds. The IFBB's official Classic Physique formula calculates maximum allowable stage weight directly from a competitor's height in centimeters, encoding by rule what the sport's original judging framework was supposed to enforce by standard. The competition preparation handbook for the division describes the purpose without euphemism. Bodybuilding in the IFBB had primarily become a mass game, and Classic Physique has weight limits based on a competitor's height to encourage a more aesthetic physique. That sentence, to encourage a more aesthetic physique, is the clearest statement the governing body has publicly produced about what the men's open division had become. It doesn't say men's open went wrong. It says men's open had primarily become a mass game, as though this were a weather condition rather than the accumulated product of specific judging decisions made in Orlando and Helsinki and Las Vegas across a 23-year stretch. And it says Classic Physique exists to encourage something more aesthetic. More aesthetic than what, exactly? The statement declines to specify. The height-based weight caps answer the question structurally. more aesthetic than whatever a man standing 5 feet 11 inches and weighing 296 pounds at competition conditioning constitutes. You don't build a division with height-based weight formulas and explicit aesthetic mandates to recreate an ideal unless you understand that the division running alongside it has stopped producing that ideal. The governing body never called classic physique a correction. Institutions rarely announce their own errors in those terms. But the architecture of what they built in 2016 communicates what no press release would state directly. They knew what had been lost. They had understood what losing it had cost them, and they were engineering a structure to recover it without acknowledging that the loss had been their doing. 23 years elapsed between the 1993 Olympia and the 2016 Classic Physique launch. Between those two dates, the documented progression from 257-pound Yates to 296-pound Coleman. The emergence of Palumboism as a routine visual feature of the sport's premier event. Academic literature classifying the sport's most celebrated physiques as a form of infrequent. Men dying in their 40s waiting for heart transplants. And the complete failure of any mass-era champion to achieve the mainstream cultural footprint the Golden Era had built. The IFBB looked at 23 years of those consequences and responded not with a correction to the men's open scoring criteria, but with a new division. Classic Physique doesn't repair men's open. It runs alongside it, offering what men's open no longer provides, which is, in its own way, an answer. Chris Bumstead first competed in Classic Physique at the 2016 Olympia, the division's inaugural year. He won his first Classic Physique Mr. Olympia title in 2019 and has won it 6 consecutive times through 2024. His Instagram account, @cbum, holds 26 million followers. For comparison, the IFBB created a separate division specifically to house the physique those 26 million people are following. Bumstead's physique isn't a museum recreation. He's a 2024 competitor built under modern training science with modern supplementation on a 2024 competitive rulebook. But the aesthetic language is the same one the Golden Era defined. Broad shoulders, proportional waist, the V-taper that the Sandow Trophy depicts. When someone who doesn't follow competitive bodybuilding encounters his image, they respond to it as a fitness ideal rather than as a physical curiosity. With the same recognition that Arnold generated in the 1980s, the same response the human eye produces when proportion and mass coexist rather than compete. That response, rendered 26 million times on a single platform, is the clearest available measure of what the fans had always wanted and had spent 2 decades not finding in the sport's main event. 63 Classic Physique athletes competed at the 2024 Olympia. The division has been described in the sport's own publications as the largest growing category in competitive bodybuilding. Muscle and Fitness, the publication that covered mass monsters through the Yates and Coleman eras, has acknowledged that Classic Physique is getting huge attention, even as the Open division retains its historical priority in prize money and institutional prestige. The fans found the physique they'd been waiting for, and the sport found it had significantly more of those fans than it had known while it was giving them something else. The case against the IFBB judging apparatus has 3 counts, and the evidence supports each without requiring the prosecution to overstate what it says. First, from approximately 1992 forward, the Mr. Olympia judges consistently rewarded extreme muscle mass over aesthetic proportion, despite a judging framework that nominally maintained symmetry and proportion as primary criteria. No rule was formally revised. The shift occurred through accumulated scoring decisions, each one individually defensible, catastrophic in aggregate, and the competitive field had no rational choice but to follow the scores wherever they led. They led to a pharmaceutical arms race that produced Palumboism, shortened careers, and men who died awaiting heart transplants in their 40s. Dorian Yates wasn't the villain of this story. He was a rational competitor responding to the only signal that mattered in professional bodybuilding. Ronnie Coleman wasn't the villain. He took that logic to its furthest documented endpoint with the specific genetic capacity to do so. The judges built the incentive structure. The competitors followed it. That is the correct assignment of responsibility. Second, the aesthetic the judging abandoned was precisely the one that had given the sport its mainstream cultural relevance. The Golden Era produced Arnold. produced pumping iron, produced gym memberships among people who had never heard of the IFBB, produced physiques that people with no connection to competitive sport put on their walls because something in the human visual system recognizes the V-taper as the ideal expression of capable strength. The mass era produced physiques that sports sociology, reviewing the evidence, categorized as spectacle rather than aspiration. The fans who had grown up with the golden era aesthetic felt something go wrong, even when they couldn't name it precisely. They were right every single time they felt it. Third, in 2016, the governing body created classic physique, with height-based weight caps, explicit aesthetic mandates, and a name drawn directly from the era its judging had displaced, to provide competitive space for the physique it had spent 23 years refusing to reward at the top level of its primary division. The announcement embedded "bygone era" in its first sentence. The rules encoded the proportions. The name said what the official statement never would. Lee Haney competed at 254 pounds with a 31.5-inch waist and said, "The shoulder and waist ratio was very important during the era which we came through." He said it in the past tense, as a man describing something that no longer existed. Not because it had failed, but because the judges had stopped caring whether it succeeded. He was right about what the ideal was. He was right that it was gone. The physique the world fell in love with wasn't lost to progress. Progress would have built something better, would have found ways to add mass while preserving proportion, to move the standard forward rather than sideways. What happened wasn't progress. It was a judging apparatus that stopped caring about what had made the sport worth watching, that rewarded a different standard through institutional inertia for 23 years, and that eventually built a separate division to contain what it had refused to reward, without ever acknowledging that the refusal had been a mistake. Every person who kept pumping iron saved not for training tips, but because it showed a version of the sport they recognized as true, right. Every person who scrolled past men's open content in the 2000s and felt an unspecified wrongness they couldn't fully name, right. Every person who looked at an Olympia stage sometime around 2003 and thought, "This isn't what bodybuilding is supposed to be," right. Every time. The physique didn't die because the audience stopped wanting it. The audience never stopped wanting it. The judges stopped rewarding it. The competitors had no rational choice but to stop chasing it. And for 23 years, the ideal survived only in archive footage and old photographs and the accumulated memory of people who had been there and hadn't forgotten what the sport had once been capable of producing. Then you made enough noise. Not in any organized way, but through 26 million Instagram follows and 63 athletes at a single contest, and the sustained refusal to pretend the original aesthetic had simply gone obsolete, that the governing body had no commercially viable path that didn't involve building a structure for what the fans had never stopped wanting. They killed it. You kept it alive. You were right the whole time. Subscribe for more stories like this.